So this is podcast episode number 1. Good morning. I'm here with Amber Oquindo. She is.
Hello.
Morning, Amber. We're not actually sitting in the same room, but we're here today to talk about the upcoming conference that we have scheduled June 3-4 at the UCLA Luskin Center in Los Angeles. One of the topics that Amber will be discussing in the conference is malign influence and disinformation. Now, there's a lot of discussion in the media about what's real, what's not, what's fake news, what's not. And Amber's course is designed to help take to teach you exactly what is truthful and how to find out if it's correct. So, we have a couple of questions to ask Amber today. One is, what is the definition of malign influence and what tactics can be used to exert this influence?
Well, that's a great question. Malign influence really refers to using different tactics to exert influence over individuals, organizations, or governments to achieve its very specific objectives. So when we're talking about tactics, this can be propaganda, cyber attacks, economic pressure, and that includes the use of disinformation. Both state and non-state actors can conduct malign influence and target various domains, including political infrastructures, economic systems, social interactions, as well as targeting military and law enforcement.
Fantastic. So it's actually, it's intentional. They're doing
it. It is intentional. Yes.
In order to achieve a particular outcome. It's like, I guess, what would an example recently been in the news? Do you have an example you can provide of malign influence?
Sure. So when we're talking about an individual or a group that is trying to exert influence over individuals or organizations to achieve an specific objective, it is very intentional. And they do this by spreading disinformation. As this information spreads, it does become misinformation. So disinformation is the intentional spreading of false claims, false information basically being shared. But the person who is absorbing that disinformation may not recognize it as being false. As they then continue to spread those same false claims, it becomes misinformation. So disinformation shares the intent of the malign influencer that they want to spread false claims. But the misinformation that is then being spread, 10 times is done that with the thought that they are spreading true information. So it's just a mistake. It is not intentional. And that exacerbates what that original false claim is. We have seen this, time in and time again. It can be from what a institution does. It can be from trying to counter what governments or organizations are trying to tell us. We saw a lot of misinformation. We've all just recently been through the COVID-19 pandemic, and we all know that a lot of misinformation was shared because the original intent was to spread false claims. So that initial disinformation, and this information can be about where it started from, how it's spreading, what are our mitigation strategies, what is the real danger individuals are facing. All of this information was wrapped up initially as disinformation intended to confuse, and then the misinformation was then shared widespread by people who took the information as being true.
So the goal of malign influence is to sow discord and confusion among American voters. That would be one.
You got it.
The example that I've seen in the past is, the malign influence of the Russian government in the 2016 presidential election. It is alleged that the Russian government used a range of tactics to interfere in the election, including spreading disinformation.
Correct.
Social media, hacking, leaking emails from political campaigns, and targeting election infrastructure. So ultimately, with the goal to sow discord, did that work?
Absolutely. And you you kind of hit the nail on the head there when you brought up social media. A vast majority of individuals go to social media for their regular news. So when you target social media platforms with this disinformation, it spreads like wildfire. It gets shared, reposted, sent on. It's so quick and easy to spread that disinformation initially that it then gets taken as truth and is spread even further. And that's the danger of disinformation being spread and then shared, because you're taking that information as truth, spreading it in good faith that it is correct, when in fact all you're doing is actually spreading the false claims.
Right, absolutely. So this undermines our governments, our organizations, democratic institution, and the rule of law. And with disinformation, my second question was, so intentionally false or misleading information that is spread with the intention of deceiving or manipulating people. Can you explain how fake news and the specific type of disinformation creates, legitimate news stories, or under the guise of legitimate news stories?
Sure. So disinformation and fake news are actually really related concepts, and they're not exactly the same. So fake news is a type of disinformation that generally refers to the intentional fabrication of news stories and being presented as if they were real. So this disinformation, on the other hand, is a more broader term that encompasses various forms of sharing false or misleading information that can be used for a range of purposes for manipulation and deception. So when we're talking about how does it undermine a government process, for example, you have spread disinformation, fake news, right? You have presented it as being a real news story. Individuals have absorbed that information as being true and correct. They've shared that information, and then they see it bounce back. So you have that reconfirmation of validation that that information is correct. Then you compare that to the information that's being shared by your government agencies or your, electorate, whatever public facing interaction that you are having, and the information that they're sharing is not matching the information that you have seen through these fake news stories. And so then you have that discontent, that mistrust. Why are they telling me something that isn't correct, when in fact you were initially exposed to the incorrect disinformation through fake news, and now you're having a hard time reconciling that.
So with the next question, we've talked about how misinformation and malign influence, disinformation, can undermine trust in institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Talked about the erosion of the democratic society from the continued use of malign influence and misinformation. We saw that in the last election. There was so much disinformation spread about the results of the election, the different cases involving, undermining the electoral process, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Bad election counts. What is the actual impact of malign influence? How can it destabilize international relations at this point?
Absolutely. So once you sow discord between a population and its governing authority, so with your example for the results of the election, once you sow discord between its population's trust in its electoral system, and you've provided that same population with disinformation and fake news stories, you've already laid the foundation for this is what is true. So now your authority, your government, your electoral college, whatever institution, now has to not only provide you with true and accurate information, but now they also have to disprove what the majority has already taken to be as truth, because they've already been exposed to that disinformation. And so once you break down that trust between your governing authority and your population, now you're talking about losing legitimacy in your authority. And that causes major strife within countries.
Yep.
Now, if you spread that beyond to what is the real impact on its international stage, it's the same concept. once you've established that one group, one organization, one region, one country, one state has lost that legitimacy, it's going to ripple effect over all of your other interactions. Once a country loses its legitimacy within its own people, then any international organization or coalition that they are then a part of is going to be questioned. So it is not contained, it is not local, it does have far-reaching and really deep impacts on an international stage when you're talking about losing legitimacy due to disinformation.
So the last question, thank you for that explanation. That was brilliant. Social media platforms and other institutions have an important role to play in addressing the challenges posed by malign influence and disinformation. Well, what steps should social media companies take? I mean, all politics aside, what steps should they take to identify and remove false or misleading content?
Right. So we kind of saw part of this previously when Twitter would start marking unsubstantiated claims on posts, right? So that is a step in the right direction. So they're taking the information that is being used to sow that discord because it has the intent to provide disinformation and exert a malign influence over a population. That was then recognized that this claim is false, so we're going to tag it. That then that presents a forward-facing evidence for the population that is going to be absorbing that information, that this might not be right, I might want to look into it further. And that's one of the main ways that you can check your sources and see if the information that you're receiving is in fact correct or incorrect.
Now, in your upcoming conference scheduled for June, in
Yes.
your malign influence and disinformation program, the course that you just developed actually looks at how to identify, how to remove or misleading content, how to identify that, do reverse image searching, and promote media literacy. I think media literacy in education is key, and also helping to develop a little bit more critical thinking skills when it comes into, just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. And I think there's a large majority of the population that just, they're influencers on one hand and they want to do the right thing, but sometimes they promote misleading things. So how can governments get involved, and what role can they play with either regulation or transparency or accountability? How can that help stop malign influence?
That's a very broad question, and that's a very deep answer with a lot of different facets to it. But if we're talking about just one slice of accountability, is if an individual does intentionally, and this is the key word, intentionally spreads disinformation and exerts that malign influence for the purpose of sowing discord, then that person needs to be held accountable, because it does have far-reaching implications, especially if that individual that's promoting something that is false can lead to the harm of others. So that is a very real way that there needs to be some accountability held. If we're talking about government officials, absolutely, especially our elected officials that are supposed to be sharing the information as they have it, as the correct and true information, because we as citizens are trusting those individuals that we have elected into the office to look out for us and our best interests. They absolutely need to be held accountable for sharing information that is true and correct. And that's where the sticking point is between disinformation, which has the intent, and misinformation, which was taken as true and then spread as a mistake. And again, accountability needs to be taken in both cases, but especially if the intent is to sow discord, then accountability is key. And that can be applied to individuals, organizations, governments. Accountability and transparency has to be a foundation of that, regardless of what area that you're working in.
No, I agree 100%. And I think for now, that's all the time we have, but I just want to segue back to, we've talked about the intentional use of malign influence. We've talked how disinformation refers to the intentional false and misleading information and the potential impacts of influence and malign influence and disinformation. Social media platforms and government do have a responsibility to also help in this fight. If you want to hear more on this topic, June 3rd and 4th at the UCLA Luskin Conference Center, you can see Miss Amber Oquendo live, and she will talk about her new program, Malign Influence and Disinformation, which is it's a level 7 course of information. There's all sorts of information in it that students will get, and professionals as well. You can go to globalctinstitute.org and either go to Facebook or LinkedIn and see our brochure for the event, and you can RSVP up till now. We do have some limited seating, and we are doing a flash sale on the first 40 people, which if you wait too long, you're liable to miss. So you're liable to miss that discount. So with that, I want to thank Amber for talking with us today, and that's the end of our program.